Hi everybody. In this module I'm going to touch on cross-cultural negotiation. It's really become a fact of life over the last 30 to 40 years that business has become more and more international. Even if you're living in a small town, you are surrounded by people from different cultures. You're dealing with people virtually or digitally in different cultures. You have people from different cultures living around you. You may even be somebody living in a different or a foreign culture. And there's been so much that has been written about and research around cultural differences, different ways of expressing yourself depending on part of the world that you're from. And it can be, complete maze to try and navigate what to do in the context of cross-cultural negotiations, doing business cross-culturally. So what I've really done is I've studied this area, is try to distill it into something that's really simple and straightforward. I'll never forget the one time I was going to fly from London to Shanghai in China, and I popped into the bookstore at the airport. It was the first time I went out there, and I bought a book which was called How to Negotiate in China. So I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. Let me get that book. And when I opened it up on the plane and I wanted to start reading it, and I didn't look at the contents before I bought it. I just bought it based on the cover. When I looked at the contents, it spoke about the 36 basic strategies of negotiating in China. And I didn't even read it, because if the, basic strategies number 36, if there are 36 basic strategies, I don't want to even get to the advanced strategies. You just can't get your head around 36 strategies, 36 ways to do things. So from the very outset when you look at that's probably something that was put out by an academic, and great job to them for doing that kind of research, but they've not packaged that in a way that you can use. It's not really useful to you, has very little utility value. So what I've tried to do here in this short module is just give you some shortcuts to negotiating with different cultures, and they, depending on who's counting and whose input you regard as the authority on this, there's probably something like 2,000 different cultures around the world, and there's lots of variation within ethnic culture. 2,000 different, I think more than 2,000 different languages. So there's a lot of complexity around this. If you want to boil it down to specific strategies and tactics and techniques, etc., it'll become something that is just almost impossible to do. It'll be just way too complex. So what I've done is to really boil it down to some practical things that you can do to help you to be successful when you're negotiating across cultures. The first thing to understand is that there are very different types of culture, right? It's not just ethnic culture that we look at. So often when we think about culture, we kind of stare blindly into the fact that somebody's German or they're Japanese or they're American or they're Canadian or they're Mexican. And we forget that there are different cultures. It's not just ethnic culture that's key to consider. Just within the U.S., there are many different ethnic cultures too. You have a Latino culture. You have a Native American culture. You have the European influence culture. So just within the U.S., there are also sub-ethnic cultures at play. Never mind the secondary or group cultures that you'll find influencing different environments. So the company that you work for, or the organization that you represent, or the organization that you're negotiating with, they will have their own organizational culture, right? So if you're doing business with Microsoft in the US and you're doing business with Microsoft in South Africa or Australia, you can safely assume that there's going to be a similar corporate or organizational culture in place within that organization. So the way they do things will be similar to a large extent. Religious culture, there are shared things amongst religion, different religious groups and different religions, right? So Jewish people will approach things from one perspective, Christians maybe from one perspective, Hindus or Muslims from a specific perspective that's in line with their belief system. So it's also interesting to understand the religious culture within which people operate, because even though they might be in different geographies, if people have the same culture, when it comes to religion, they might be doing things in a similar way. And then, of course, you also have professional cultures, specifically within a business context. So accountants will, have a similar way of doing things, regardless of where they are. Lawyers will have similar ways of doing things. Doctors will have similar standards and ways that they do things. So there's also a professional cultural element to consider. So don't stare blindly into ethnic culture. Ethnic culture is probably hyped up way too much. The one thing that I've clearly learned through all my travel, and I've had the opportunity to work, consult, and deliver training in 65 countries around the world. And the more that I've traveled, the more I've realized that people are the same. The more I see different people, different cultures, the more I realize that we're not as different as we think we are. Sure, there are some cultural differences in place that are pretty glaring and obvious in certain environments, but people fundamentally are motivated by the same things. Like Maslow's hierarchy. We desire the same things. We desire shelter, food, security, significance, self-actualization, all these things. They are similar regardless of what culture you find yourself in. So we can easily make too much of cultural differences. But let's talk specifically about what you can do depending on what culture you're from and what kind of culture you're getting ready to sell to or negotiate with, right? So to make things really simple, we can think of two ways to characterize or describe cultures. Number one, we have a high context culture, and then we have a low context culture. So high context and low content, or low context and high content type cultural environments, right? So a high context type of culture is an environment where people feel responsible for their family. They value the concept of face or credibility, so the public image is very important to them. And if a member's face or credibility is threatened, then it compromises the honor of the whole group. So, for instance, the Chinese, the Koreans, Japanese, Arab cultures tend to value face. They group-based cultures rather than individualistic cultures. The low-context, high-content cultures, independence and individualism is typically emphasized in those environments. So your identity is more associated with your independence than with the group. So people like to stand out from the group. So there's no strong concept really of face. However, nobody likes to sacrifice their credibility, right? But it's not so important to maintain your face, if you will, in front of your peers as it is in the high context cultures. People tend to be responsible for themselves, and so you can see this is mostly the North American, Northern European kind of cultures that would be low context. And one of the practical ways that you can really try and figure out if you're dealing with a high context or a high content kind of culture is to look at the sophistication of the financial system in place within that country or territory. When there's a sophisticated financial system in place, then it's easier to access capital. It becomes easier to insure against risk. And so the importance of the relationship is somewhat diminished in that context. The other angle that you want to look at is the sophistication of the legal system, right? So how mature and sophisticated is the legal system? I mean, this is one of the reasons why Great Britain is such a great destination for investors, because they have such a stable, predictable legal system with precedent and case law that makes it a safe place for people to do business. And so once again, if you have a strong legal and financial infrastructure in place that's highly evolved and sophisticated, then there's less importance associated with the context or the relationships, because if things go wrong, we'll just litigate. We'll just go, according to the agreement that we've agreed. Whereas in countries with less sophisticated legal and financial systems, the context becomes much more important. So if we were to plot it graphically, and please don't see this as a definitive view on where a country fits. I've just tried to create some examples here of countries that have a focus on high content or high context, and you can see that there are perhaps a few of them where both of those things are important. We've seen as some of the high context countries increase the sophistication of their legal and financial systems, you can see them moving up from the high context area over here to also bring in a focus on the high content environments, right? And then there's some in between and some, really focused on the context environment only. So many places, probably most places in Africa, you will see a focus on the context as being the primary preference. And North America, Northern Europe, you'll see it primarily focus on the content elements, right? So what does this mean for the way that you do business, for the way that you negotiate with people who come from these areas, if they're living in your country or if you're selling internationally or negotiating internationally? Well, here are the shortcuts, if you will. If you're in a content-focused environment, then bring in the lawyers and the advisors early on in negotiations. Everybody's going to be happy. You can get things done much quicker. During the negotiations, you maintain the presence of the lawyers and the advisors, and after the negotiations, then that diminishes, right? Before you get into negotiations in a content-focused environment, there's not going to be much small talk and socializing. Maybe a little more during negotiations, but after you've done the deal, then perhaps there's the opportunity to socialize and have some small talk. In the content-driven environments, it's important that business gets done first. And if business has been done successfully, if you've proven your ability, if you've remained consistent with the commitments you've made, then it's okay for us to socialize and spend time away from doing business, in a personal or a social context. Do we spend much time in a content-focused environment getting to know all the stakeholders informally? No. Maybe a little more during the negotiations. Even after the negotiation, we don't spend that much time with all the, probing and exploring all the interest of all the stakeholders, getting to meet them personally. And then the importance of saving face is not that significant before negotiations. During negotiations, it's more important, and also after negotiations. And what we really say here, when it comes to saving face, every person in the world would like to maintain their credibility, regardless of the culture that they're from. But in a litigious environment, in an evidence-led environment, people are more used to being proven wrong than they are in the context-driven environment. So you can get away with it a little more in terms of being more direct and critical of somebody's approach within the content-driven environment. I would still not recommend that you do that. My recommendation would be that you always allow people the opportunity to save face, to maintain their credibility. Because if you don't, you force them to defend their perspective. You force them to go to the evidence. So even though the content-driven cultures don't necessarily associate so much value to saving face, if you don't allow them the opportunity to save face, what you will do is force them to justify their position, to be defensive, to object. You will effectively provoke the objection, and by doing so, you will make it almost impossible to reach agreement. So my recommendation is to always let people save face. So in the content-focused cultural environment, you want to make sure to involve finance and legal early on in the negotiations. You don't have to hold back. Whereas if you're in the context-focused environment, you don't want to bring finance and legal in early. That would just communicate a lack of trust, right? That would almost transmit a defensive posture to your counterpart if you do that early on in the negotiation in a context-focused environment. What you should expect, if you're negotiating in a context-specific environment and you come from a content-focused environment, you should expect to spend a lot of time in informally getting to know all the stakeholders, not just the key ones, all the stakeholders. And it's going to be important for you to know that they need to save face. They need to be held in high esteem. Lots of time spent on small talk and socializing, and this is going to continue throughout the negotiation. Even after the negotiation, there's going to always be a focus and a premium associated with maintaining a strong relationship. And by the way, that's smart. That's smart. If you're doing business in a context-driven environment, guess what? They don't really value the contract as much as you do if you come from a content-driven environment. So also, if let's say you're in China and you're based in the US and you want to sue your Chinese business partner, I can already tell you that it's going to be very, very difficult for you to get the court to decide in your favor if it's going to happen in China. So why would you want to focus on the content anyway? The way that you're going to manage that agreement is through managing the relationship. Yes, maybe you're going to need a contract so that you have a summary of what was agreed, and so that you can protect your legacy and for succession and all those kind of things. But you don't close that contract, you don't sign that agreement with a view to be ever put in a position where you're going to pursue that in court in China. It's not going to work in your favor. It's not going to work for you. It's going to be much more important that you manage the relationship, and you do so proactively, and you manage the relationship with the focus also on succession. So you don't want to just know one person. You want to know a number of people, from your counterpart's organization. You want to remember at all times to allow them the opportunity to save face, because they simply cannot agree with you. They'll have to walk away if they have to sacrifice their credibility. And the way you do that is by creating space for people to move in your direction, right? And that's through effectively, being ambitious in your anchors and being always willing to make concessions. So this is just a mindset that you need to develop to get into, is that there always needs to be room for negotiation. Because if you don't leave room for negotiation, particularly with context-driven cultures, then it's going to be very difficult to get to a deal, because the moment you get into defending your value, then there's no space for them to save face. Then they have to come back with their evidence, and then you're going to be stuck. Let me also point out that if you're in context-driven environments, typically the level of negotiation tends to be more extreme, so they tend to be more ambitious. So the levels at which the initial anchors will come will be probably a lot higher than they would in a content-driven environment. So if I'm negotiating in Germany and I want $100 for an item, I might ask for $105. I have a small room for negotiation. But if I'm in China or if I'm in the Middle East, I'm going to leave myself significantly more room for negotiation. If I want to end up with $100, maybe I'm going to start off asking for $130, $140, because I need to create more satisfaction in that space. I need to be seen to be much more willing to make concessions in those different environments. I must be much more willing to be seen to be willing. I must be much more willing in the context-driven environment to make concessions to satisfy the needs of my counterparts. So I hope you find that useful in terms of preparing you for discussions or negotiations in a cross-cultural context. Just make sure that you don't stare blindly into the ethnic cultural differences. Also consider the secondary layers of culture. And you will find, if you just stick to these elements here, that cross-cultural negotiations, are really not that hard. It's not that important for you to know every single cultural nuance that you can encounter. One of the best ways that I've dealt with cross-cultural negotiations is to, when I meet people from different cultures, just to let them know up front that, I'm really willing to do things, as much as I can in a way that makes sense to you. The rule of thumb being, if I go to South Korea to do business there, then I'm going to respect the South Korean culture and tradition. And I'm going to tell my hosts, I am not South Korean. I've read up a little bit on South Korea, and I understand some of the cultural context there, but I'm going to ask you to forgive me if I do anything to offend you, because I want you to know that it's never my intent to offend you. Right? If I make a mistake, then I really value your grace. And then similarly, if somebody comes to your country, to your environment, then the obligation would be on them to respect your cultural traditions, right? And to try and do things in a way that makes sense within that cultural context. But it also demands of you to have extra grace, because guess what? People don't purposely try to offend other people. 9 times out of 10, when people are offended, it is not on purpose. It's not because somebody has gone out to violate people's norms or expectations. So you're going to have an extra dose of grace when you're negotiating cross-culturally, and understand that different cultures also have communication styles which can seem very aggressive or very submissive, and you need to leave account for that. For instance, I've done a lot of business in Germany, and when German people speak English, German is a very direct communication language. The style of communication is very direct. English is a very indirect kind of language for communication. English people don't necessarily position things as directly as as German people do. And when German people speak English, English people often have the experience that the Germans are abrupt or rude or very direct, and they interpret that as being offensive or aggressive. When, as a matter of fact, it's not at all. It's just a different communication style. When you really start to understand the motivation and the approach that Germans have to business, then you learn that they are amazingly skilled at doing business. It's the German culture, the German nature are very, very good at exporting. They export, I think, just about more than any other nation in the world in terms of value of export. So they're very global. They have great relationships with almost every country on the face of the planet. So, just in English, we interpret their communication style sometimes as being aggressive, but it's a complete rabbit trail because it's not the case at all. Often, we can think of the Russian accent as the same, but and I've been to Russia a number of times. It's not the heart of the people. It's not the intent. It's just lost in translation. So you need to apply a bit of a filter when you're talking to somebody, and you have the benefit of speaking to them in English. They're speaking your language rather than you speaking their language. So that's another big reason why you should be very, very happy to play the grace card and not to be literal in your understanding of what they're communicating, because at least if nothing else, they're extending you the courtesy of negotiating with you in your first language, in your mother tongue, rather than the other way around. Just imagine what you might sound like if you were to try to negotiate in Korean or in German or in Russian. Well, it might not go so well for you. You might very well be misunderstood, right? You might have all the difficulty that they have. So you really have to apply grace. You really have to ask questions to make sure that you're really understanding what they're saying. So repeat back to them what you're hearing. Ask them to confirm it. Don't make assumptions. Just make sure that that you extend them the courtesy that you would have liked to be extended if you had to speak their language and do things their way.